Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 214 of Psychology World Podcast with me, Con Whiteley. And today's episode is on, does a therapist's gender matter in therapy? And it is the 21st of June 2023 as I record this. So it's a Wednesday today, so I'm having to record this a bit early because I'm away at the weekend. But today's episode is really fun and really is quite thought-provoking because the gender of a therapist isn't really something that we think about too much within clinical psychology, because we all know that the therapeutic alliance is a lot more important, and basically the gender of the therapist compared to the client is basically non-existent, or it really does not matter whatsoever. That's the sort of thing that I'm actually trying to say here. But when it comes to our clients, sometimes they do have very strong gender preferences. For example, like sometimes men prefer to see male therapists, or men would like to see female therapists for a particular reason, or vice versa. But in today's episode, we actually explore the truth about this. In what situations could this be important to listen to, but also why this needs to be challenged in certain situations. So really interesting, really thought-provoking for us as future or current clinical psychologists. So it's a lot of fun. Definitely listen to that. So moving on to the psychology news section, we've reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest, but because I've not got this week's, we are reading one from April 2023, but they're still really, really interesting, especially the third one. But the first one is, the appraisal strategy for regulating emotion can also boost creativity. The ability to regulate our emotions by reframing the meaning of emotional events is an important skill. We may need to psych ourselves up when feeling unconfident, or make ourselves feel calmer when we're under stress. For example, by reinterpreting situations or thinking about them in a more positive way. Giving events new meaning in this way, it may often require us to think creatively, and now a new study has found that using this strategy can actually boost our creativity more generally, or at least those of us who are not naturally particularly creative thinkers. Okay, so this is actually quite a good one though, because as you know, as a fiction and a non-fiction writer, I am a quite creative person, including a really, really cool project that I've actually done this week. I might talk about it in the personal update, but I probably won't because it's not psychology related. Anyway, though, but creativity is important for all of us, regardless if we are writers or artists, but also for everyday people that aren't artists by nature, because we need to think creatively to solve problems, be this a job, in the family life, or even in our own relationships. Being a creative is always important. And then if we think about the more macro issues of the world, like the economy, then having creative people would come up with creative solutions is even more important. It's important though. So I would say definitely listeners, definitely try it, because you might find that it's really beneficial for you in your relationships, because we do need to boost our creativity, especially as a few years ago, even though I know it's just as relevant now because we were talking about it at my university the other day, that some of the top skills that employers are looking for is that creativity and a creative problem solving. So you might not just be benefiting yourself and your own relationships, by doing this reappraisal strategy, but you might even be in improving your future job prospects, which is always nice. So the second one is language as a tool to shape how we think of gender. To combat gender stereotypes, we need to look closely at the language we use. This might sound obvious, but recent work is revealing just how language can promote these stereotypes, even inadvertently, and how to counteract it. Emma Young explores this research in her latest feature, which you can also find in the May issue of The Psychologist. So I'm not going to go into this in too much depth, except from I've actually covered this before on the psychology news section. So, for example, I will always remember the psychology news section where I covered that saying that girls are just as good as boys is actually really damaging. Because by saying that you're just as good as them, it does sort of enforce that stereotype, because you wouldn't need to say it unless girls were worse than boys, or if there is that perception. So I do think that this is part of a larger debate about the traditional sayings, at least that we say, to sort of counteract this, and actually see if these strategies that we do use to counteract stereotypes actually work, or if they have the unintended effect of actually confirming them. Because that example that I just gave is actually a brilliant example. Well, because all of us say that girls are just as good as men at a sports form example to sort of counteract the stereotype, but research shows that actually confirms the stereotype. So it'd be interesting to see what other sayings that we say quite innocently do actually have the damaging side effects. So definitely something for future research. And the last one is, and this is something that universities are, I think they're starting to get quite hot on, but more work needs to be done. Gender biases in students' evaluations of their lecturers. Women are still underrepresented in academia, particularly in higher positions. There are a number of complex reasons for this, but the promotion of women is clearly an important factor. Promotion in academia often relies on how educators are appraised by their students. Unfortunately, researchers have now found that student evaluations are influenced by gender compositions of academic departments. The team finds that higher level courses, students tend to give worse evaluations to those in the gender minority. So this, I think, is definitely a massive shame, and to be honest, I'm guilty in the sense I don't do student evaluations. I know I shouldn't. I'm sure if there are academics listening to this, they're probably shouting at me right now, but I just don't. Because I don't know. And I know my university is really good at actually listening to feedback, so I cannot fault them. And I know these do make a difference, and I do feel a bit guilty now. In fact, I really do feel quite guilty, but I just don't do them. I will in the future though, because mainly for this reason, because my psychology department is absolutely different. There are more men than women. There are some people that we like in the psychology department, and there are some people that we just don't. But I know I should evaluate all of them, though, because my lecturers are absolutely brilliant, especially the women lecturers. Because in my psychology department, I tend to find that some stereotypes are definitely true. Like the older male ones, I mean, yes, they are typical older men and they do talk quite boringly. But then on the other hand, there's this absolutely brilliant Middle Eastern lecturer, and he is just brilliant. He basically rips up the rule book about how to give a lecture, and it's so engaging, so fun, and we just love it. And then there's the women, which again, because they're really passionate about it, and they're a lot more expressive and emotional, it really does come through, and that makes it a lot more fun too. Yeah, and I definitely find that the women lecturers, who are also a clinical psychologist, they're a lot more likely to make snide comments about the NHS and about the working conditions, and so like they're sort of cases. But again, like, it brings it alive. It makes it more fun. And yeah, I do feel guilty because I should have put that in the evaluation. I should have helped these lecturers and the people in charge of them actually realise that they are brilliant. So yeah, I should have done that. So I've definitely learned something because I need to do this. But I think this goes for all of us though, that in our student evaluations, we need to be aware of this. We actually need to do them, for example. But yeah, just be aware of this. It's interesting and definitely food for thought. So that's enough of the psychology news section. So let's move on to the person update. So we're moving on to the person update. So there's not going to be much of a person update simply because I'm going away to Oxford at the weekend. We've got a great weekend planned, a graduation present from my parents. I really am looking forward to it because I've always wanted to go to Oxford. I've just never been, so I really am looking forward to that. And because I will be back by the time this goes out, if you want to see pictures, because I will now endeavour to take pictures for you readers and you listeners, just go to Connor Whiteley fiction author or psychology author on Facebook, and then you'll see the pictures there. You might see them on Instagram at Connor Whiteley fiction. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can also email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave comments on the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi-whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by Clinical Psychology Reflections, Volume 3. So these books are slightly different from my normal psychology books, but I absolutely love them because all of my psychology books are always fact-based with a sprinkling of my own thoughts and feelings on the topic to help bring it alive, and I always write it in a really engaging tone. But these books, these are a lot more fact-based opinions or reflections on various topics within clinical psychology. And Volume 3, I think, is the best book yet because we look at some absolute brilliant topics that clinical psychologists just don't teach you in the lecture theatre. But if you talk to clinical psychologists outside of that very strict, very formal lecture theatre, though you do actually hear tons of great egg-like experiences and definitely food for thought. So this is a great, really interesting book that if you want to explore clinical psychology in that sort of outside of the classroom way, then it's an absolute brilliant guide to actually help you do that. And also, I guess you were thinking deeper about some of the hottest topics in clinical psychology at the moment. So I highly, highly recommend it. And it's always written in my fun, engaging, and easy to understand tone. So that is Clinical Psychology Reflections, Volume 3. Available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get the paperback and hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library. And you can order the ebook directly from me at payhip.com/conwhiteley. So whilst buying books helps us to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time in the creation of the show is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And there's always an absolute massive thank you to my wonderful patrons because your support helps me to know whether you like the show and you want it to continue. So if you wanted to become a patron and to get tons of great benefits like behind the scene access, and early access to the blog post, then you can become a patron at patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. So that's enough of the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be looking at does a therapist's gender matter in therapy? So but this is a lot of fun, and it's not as much important for us as future or current clinical psychologists, but it is important for our clients. And because it's important to our clients, it is important to us indirectly. And this is something that we might have to challenge and actually face in therapy. So it's still important to know about. So let's dive into it. Why do clients have gender preferences for therapists? This is definitely something that I find really interesting about clients because sometimes they prefer to see the opposite sex as therapists because if they attended a same-sex school, for example, then they might be competitive in the presence of same-sex peers. Or they might want to only see same-sex therapists because we need to remember that often clients are already embarrassed and ashamed, unfortunately, about apparently being messed up, I say in air quotes, as so many clients put it. Therefore, they might prefer to talk to a same-sex therapist because it is less embarrassing for them. Equally, you might find that because of the past events in a client's life, they're more comfortable talking about certain topics with certain genders. For example, if a woman had major depression and she believed it was mainly caused by the horrific sexism she faced at work, then she might want to talk to a woman instead of a man, and that's okay. On the other hand, I know that if I ever decided to go to therapy for my past, I would most likely probably want to talk to a male therapist because I find it easy to talk about this stuff with men, considering it was a male friend that actually started me talking about what's happened to me in the past. However, this is all subjective preference, and this is what a client feels. All these preferences are valid, but they are certainly not the be-all and end-all of psychological therapy. So what makes good therapy? Time and time again, therapists, regardless of their age, gender, and therapeutic model, all agree that the strongest predictor of whether a therapy will work or not is the therapeutic alliance. This is the strength of the connection between the therapist and the client, and that is very much built on acceptance, respect for each other, and empathy. This is also supported by tons of research, and a lot of meta-analyses have found that all the studies show the same general direction of the relationship. The stronger the alliance, the higher chance the therapy has of working. Whereas when studies looked at gender preferences and therapy outcomes, the results are nowhere near as clean cut, since some studies show when a gender match happens, the therapy is more likely to work, but other studies don't. However, the real problem with this gender question is that the question is typically muted at this point in the time, since it really does not matter whatsoever what a client wants in terms of gender. Not only because the public mental health services are so stretched, clients are basically thrown with a certain therapies just to get through the backlog, but because clinical psychology itself is such a female-dominated workforce. What shapes a client's gender preference? In all honesty, there isn't much research on how many clients set out to start therapy with a certain gender of therapist in mind. One study from Counseling Psychology Quarterly found 60% of men don't have a preference, and then the rest were basically 20% men, 20% women therapists. There was no real difference found. Therefore, it seems that whatever shapes gender preference for a therapist is highly individualistic, but there are some common themes. For example, trauma, which is a very important factor because a lot of abused women are abused by men, so a female therapist makes sense. Equally, men prefer male therapists because of the outdated and extremely pointless ideology about you can't look weak in front of a woman, and that is just nonsense. Because talking about your feelings, your pain, and your difficulties doesn't make you weak. Because, as I've said time and time again on this podcast, To be honest, it actually shows that you're actually quite a strong person, though, because it takes a lot of courage to actually go to therapy. So the fact that you've actually found that courage is actually really important, and to me, it's definitely a sign of strength. And whilst this is all perfectly valid, clients need to know or be aware that these ideals and preferences about a therapist might be limiting their search, all because of ideas and notions that will ultimately be proven false later on in the therapy. Why could gender preferences be worth listening to? So, but now that we've looked at why gender preferences towards therapists aren't a good idea, we need to look if there are any circumstances in which they actually are needed or should be listened to. And to be honest, I think there's only really one. Therefore, trauma is obviously one example because women who were being abused by men are a lot more comfortable with female therapists, and this makes for a better bond. However, most of the time, gender preferences need to be challenged even more if they are based in gender stereotype, like the idea of men not being able to show emotion in front of women, because that seriously does need to be challenged. Overall, finding a good therapist that works for a client will take time, and some clients will need to try a few different ones to find a therapist that works for them. It doesn't mean that these therapists are bad, it is just that we are social creatures and we all need to find the people that we gel with at times, especially when talking about something so personal. If you're a clinical psychologist, then this is important to be aware of. That the clients might have gender preferences that will probably need to be challenged as part of therapy. If your AI clients are listening to this, then just know that the gender of your therapist doesn't matter at all. It is all about the relationship you have with them, and that will ultimately predict whether your therapy will be a success or whether you both need to go back to the drawing board. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. I always think that these sort of soft topics and these sort of light-hearted topics are always really fun to look at because, yes, we get taught a lot of stuff like university, but again, universities cannot teach you everything. So if we cover on the podcast from time to time these more therapy-based podcast episodes, then it's really fun, it's really interesting, and we can sort of apply this knowledge in later life, or we can at least be aware of it in case this pops up in therapy. So really interesting, really important, and possibly valuable for the future. So if you know someone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more about clinical psychology, then definitely check out Clinical Psychology Reflections Volume 3, available in all the usual places. Really do recommend it. It was a lot of fun to write, so I know you're going to enjoy it. And if you wanted to become a patron of the show, then you can definitely check out patreon.com/The Psychology World Podcast. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwhiteley.net. So have a great day and I'll see you next time.